Good afternoon. Hi, I'm David Moore, Chair of the Board of UJA Federation of New York. I hope you enjoyed the Jewish Together plenary. Welcome to the session to give you a heart of flesh, Jewish responses to compassion fatigue. Thank you for joining us today. Recordings of this session and all the other workshops will be available online after the GA ends. The past 8 months have been tough, and even those of us who have been fortunate enough to stay healthy and stay employed have experienced loss, and we've all made sacrifices. But the longer we continue living in this restricted way, the harder it is to truly empathize with the suffering of others. As the number of deaths continue to climb and the urgent needs get deeper, we need to feel more, and instead it seems like we're feeling less. Is there anything we can do about it? Our speakers think there is. I'm pleased to welcome those speakers for what will be a truly extraordinary set of teachings and discussion based on our sacred text. We have Rabbi Leon Morris, president of the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies, who will also moderate the program. Tamar Rabinovitz, Dean of Jewish Studies in Hebrew at the Jewish Community High School of the Bay, and that's the San Francisco Bay. And Rabbi Mike Uram, Executive Director and Campus Rabbi of the University of Pennsylvania Hillel. Leon, take it away for us.
Thank you so much, David. When we think about the struggles of the past 7 months, which you just alluded to, David, the COVID-19 pandemic, the killing of George Floyd and how it underscored pervasive racism throughout the country, the devastating wildfires on the West Coast, the environmental crisis that makes those events more likely, a lead up to an election where it seems that everything is at stake, and in its wake, a breakdown of civility, a violation of norms, an increasing trend toward demonizing our political opponents. The list goes on. And for many of us, it feels extremely difficult to maintain concern, empathy, engagement, and compassion for so long about so many issues. The term compassion fatigue first appeared in print in 1992, and it referred to burnout from those in caregiving professions. It was subsequently broadened. Susan Sontag, the writer and critic, in her 2003 book, Regarding the Pain of Others, described compassion fatigue as being reflective of how much painful and troubling information we're exposed to daily. She writes, flooded with images of the sort that once used to shock and arouse indignation, we are losing our capacity to react. Compassion, stretched to its limits, is going numb. What Susan Sontag wrote in 2003 feels even more accurate and more descriptive today. The 24-hour news cycle, our access to information from everywhere in the world at all times can be simply overwhelming. To be particularly moved or disturbed or outraged or called to action is made so much more difficult by the number of reports and images and issues we're confronted with on a daily basis. How do we maintain our sense of compassion? How can we simultaneously care about so many things, so many issues, when we have children to raise and work to do and communities to support and so on and so on? The three of us, Tamar, Mike, and myself, all experienced the power of rigorous and relevant text study decades ago at the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies. We are all anchored in the notion that classic Jewish texts can continue to speak to us in new ways. And so we turn to these texts for wisdom and guidance around these questions. Tamar, Mike, and I will offer ideas around this notion of compassion fatigue, mining different Jewish sources for how they might help us cultivate and preserve compassion, caring, and interest. Tamar.
Thank you, Leon. When I was approached to be on this panel, my instinct was a no. No, because I myself am overcome by the global and national disasters affecting humanity. No, because I have to juggle 3 very young children's schedule and my own. No, because I am also exhausted and overwhelmed and have not had the luxury to think about texts that might inspire me or remind me that rage and apathy are not the only 2 ways one can react. And then as I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, as is the custom these days, my mind started perusing through texts that I'm familiar with, texts that in the past have given me hope and that have reminded me that even when I think I have nothing left to give, that I do and that I must and that I'm obligated. And the very first text that came to mind was Ruth. And I'm not talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, although her life could be a text well worth studying for inspiration and motivation. I'm talking about Ruth from the book of Ruth that we read yearly on Shavuot. It is a book that I've made my responsibility to teach every year to my own students. And maybe after this really short presentation, you'll have a sense why. I also want to just say that many of the ideas that I'm going to share with you today, I got from the wonderful book called Reading Ruth, which is a collection of essays written by female scholars about Ruth. So Ruth is a story of women struggling to make it in a man's world. The book begins in the very traditional male model that we expect from biblical narratives, naming the man, in this case, Elimelech, who we think is going to be the main character of the story, and the woman is simply his wife. But then the story gets flipped, and the man dies, and he simply becomes Naomi's husband, and then the focus shifts to the relationship between Naomi and her 2 daughter-in-laws. And I want to focus on 2 interconnected themes in this book: reaction to despair, and how chesed, loving kindness, can inspire chesed and transform people and ultimately a society. So chapter 1 starts with Naomi, an Israelite who moves with her husband and her 2 sons to Moab from Judah once a famine hits the land. Her sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And as I already mentioned, very quickly, Naomi loses her husband and she also loses her 2 sons. So Ruth, Orpah, and Naomi become widowed and all have reason to despair. Naomi decides to return to Judah when she hears that the famine has ended, and Orpah and Ruth decide to go with her. At a certain point, and this is slide 1, Naomi turns to them and tells them to return to their mother's home. And she says, "Go return each woman to her mother's house. May the Lord deal with chesed with you as you have dealt with the deceased and with me. May the Lord grant you that you find rest, each woman in her husband's house." Now, chesed, as I already translated, is often translated as loving kindness, but it refers to acts of love and care and kindness that goes beyond one's obligation, and it implies an abundance of giving. God is actually described with this quality in the attributes listed in Exodus. I'm just going to quickly quote, El Rachum v'chanun erech apayim v'rav chesed ve'emet. God who is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abundant in chesed, in loving kindness. Now, slide 2. In Ruth Rabbah is a midrash that wants to clarify, well, what chesed did Ruth and Orpah do? And they say that the very first act they did was that they provided their late husbands with burial shrouds, what we would call chesed shel emet, a true kindness. As it is a kindness that the beneficiary, in this case, the deceased husbands, cannot reciprocate. And the second act of chesed was for the living, was for Naomi. They relinquished the monetary obligations owed them by their husbands, thus freeing Naomi from the burden of posthumous marital compensation. Purely out of an abundance of kindness, they forfeit any claim to their deceased husband's estate. And therefore, it's very fitting that Naomi's first words in our narrative are addressed to her daughter-in-laws, where she responds to their needs and offers them the only thing she has at this moment, which is a prayer that God should respond in kind to the chesed enacted by these women. In effect, she is asking God, who embodies chesed, to be inspired by their kindness and act accordingly. And this is going to be the theme that's going to be developed in this book. So these three women stand at a crossroads, three grieving widows bound by shared pain. And then the tenor shifts, and it's the two younger women facing an embittered, depressed older woman who feels that her life has no purpose now that she is no longer a wife and no longer a mother of sons. Both young women understand Naomi's pain, but only Ruth will resist the definition of a woman's destiny that it implies. Orpah will choose to go back to her mother's house and to ultimately, most probably, find a man to marry. But Ruth, and that Hebrew is, and it's the next slide, dafkaba. Ruth clings to her. This is a term used to describe Israel's commitment and love to God and Torah. Ruth refuses to leave. She pledges her commitment not only to Naomi, but to Naomi's people and to Naomi's God. She binds herself to Naomi and to Israelite destiny, embracing God and Torah. In this act of moving to a foreign country, we also can hear the echoes of Abraham and Rebekah, where they also chose to leave to a foreign country, except Avram was promised land, great wealth, a great name, descendants. Rebekah is promised wealth, a husband, in other words, a male protector. Ruth is promised nothing, except most likely poverty and the shunning from a community that ostracizes Moabites. So like Rebekah and Abraham, Ruth leaves the familiar, goes on a risky journey. But unlike them, she has nothing to gain except for her bond with Naomi. This strengthens her act of chesed, kindness beyond obligation, to Naomi. When they arrive in Bethlehem in Judah, Naomi is at her lowest point of despair. And she utters these words to the woman who come to greet her. She says, and this is the slide that we were on before, sorry. And she says, do not call me Naomi, which means pleasantness. Call me Mara, which means bitterness, because God has made things bitter for me. I left full and God has brought me back empty. Egocentrically, she repeats the words me, li, bi 5 times in those two verses, 20 to 21. And she ignores Ruth's presence, Ruth's love, Ruth's loyalty. And I always imagine what Ruth must be feeling as she hears these words coming out of her mother-in-law's mouth. And I'm sure I would have said something in response. But Ruth is silent. And I like to think that she's actually not overcome by Naomi's despair, but she understands her bitterness and can empathize with her perspective at that particular moment. And here we see two very different reactions to loss. Ruth seems to have a faith in a God of hope and a God of life, and as a result is not affected by the despair of others, as opposed to Naomi, who is in some sort of post-traumatic crisis and has become a bitter, self-pitying survivor, blaming God. Now, no one in Bethlehem actually takes the initiative to help Naomi, and one suspects that it's probably the presence of Ruth the Moabite. Now, Ruth is not only a poor widow, which is one of the most vulnerable members in biblical society. She is not only a foreigner, also one of the most vulnerable members in biblical society. She is a foreigner from a despised people. In the book of Deuteronomy, we read that we must utterly reject marriage to Moabites and any concern for their welfare. So now, with no food, Ruth has to take the initiative in her new land amongst a people that reject her to go find a place to glean without any help from the native Naomi. Ruth is going to have to try her own strength and also will test the people of Bethlehem's willingness to share with strangers and not exploit them, which is a biblical commandment found in Leviticus. Ruth is relying on another biblical commandment found in Leviticus to leave the corner of the field for the poor and for the stranger. The fulfillment of this commandment is a way to imitate the compassion and chesed, the kindness of God. Ruth, in effect, is going to kind of stir the covenantal community into realizing this ideal when she goes out to glean. And then the text sets us up with this great coincidence. Ruth finds herself gleaning in the field of Boaz, who happens to be Naomi's kinsman. Boaz is also a man of tremendous resources, and seems to be exceptional in his attitude towards strangers, in that he not only welcomes Ruth into his field, but he promises her protection from others, food and water. This is slide 4 now. And Ruth makes it clear in her response to Boaz that she's surprised by this. And she says, "Why have I pleased you that you should take notice of me, seeing that I am a foreigner?" And yet Boaz says that it is Ruth who has inspired his exceptional chesed. And he says, "It has been told to me all that you did for your mother-in-law after your husband's death. And you left your father and your mother and your native land, and you went to a people that you did not know before." As a result of her chesed, her kindness, Boaz is inspired to offer her generosity beyond his obligation. His chesed is in direct response to hers. Now, Ruth's courage and her chesed also inspire a response from Naomi. When Ruth returns from the Boaz's field with plenty of food, Naomi's self-perception begins to change, and she no longer sees herself as bereft, abandoned, and empty. In fact, she finally starts to see hope, to see what was always there: companionship, friendship. In Hebrew, the word can be re'ut, which some of our scholars derive the name Ruth. Ruth also helps to heal the spiritual rift and bitterness between Naomi and God. And now, in response to Ruth's chesed, and this is the next slide, she can see God's chesed. And she says, "Blessed be he of the Lord who did not leave off his kindness with the living or with the deceased." Ruth's act of chesed transforms Naomi. Naomi, who was once bitter and despairing, now acknowledges Ruth again. Naomi takes up the responsibility to take care of Ruth and to find her a husband. Naomi, who pushed Ruth away in chapter 1, now becomes the initiator of Ruth and her own salvation in chapter 3. Naomi now remembers that Boaz is actually a kinsman and a goel, meaning a redeeming kinsman, and she concocts a very bold plan to startle Boaz into reminding him of his relationship of obligation to Naomi's family. If we had time, I'd go into that plan, but we don't. As a result, Boaz will redeem Ruth, will marry Ruth, and the book ends with Ruth bearing a child. And the woman whom we met in chapter 1, when they go out to welcome Naomi, now we see them blessing her and celebrating her bounty and the overflowing generosity of Ruth represented by this child, the child from whom will ultimately come King David, and one day, as our tradition says, the Mashiach, the Messiah. To end, I actually need to contextualize the book of Ruth. The text tells us that the story is happening during the period of Shoftim, judges. This is a period marked by an absolute absence of central leadership, by violence against the most vulnerable, by corruption of the elite, a period where, and I'm quoting from Judges, each man did what was good in his eyes. And it's precisely during this period that the story of Ruth unfolds. The rich development of the theme of chesed throughout this book embodies an ideal, a vision where people fulfill mitzvot in a spirit of generosity and abundance, actively reaching out to those who are most vulnerable, those in despair. And by so doing, they imitate God, who is Rav Chesed, who is abundant in kindness. Ruth arouses the community to live up to their ideals, to what they say they stand for. Ruth acts out of chesed, and in so doing, she activates the chesed in those among whom she lives. She challenges the Jewish world to live up to Torah ideals, and in so doing, she makes manifest to us what sort of a society, what sort of a people the Torah is supposed to create. The story of Ruth is a story of a chain of chesed, each link adding goodness to the world, which would change the lives of a circle of people, and then ultimately change the world, bringing forth King David and one day Messiah. And for me, this is how I am reminded how to re-engage, that my actions can and do matter. Ruth reminds us that even in the most difficult and frightening times, ripples of loving kindness, ripples of chesed can influence our private and our public spheres of life. It is the reason why Rabbi Zera answers his own question to why was this book written at all? He says to show us the huge, enormous impact of chesed. Thank you.
Yishar Kochech. Thank you so much, Tamar. Before turning it over to Mike, Rabbi Mike Uram, I just want to remind everyone that you have a question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. And please feel free to submit a question, and we'll do our best in the last 15 minutes together to answer as many questions or address as many questions as we can. Thank you. Mike, bavakasha.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Leon. Thank you, Tamar, for the beautiful teaching. I want to also just say, when I was asked about this panel, I had similar feelings that Tamar had, which is compassion fatigue is something that I am dealing with now, as I'm sure many of us are. But I was also inspired because I love Pardes, and I think about the time that I got to spend learning there and the friendships that I made and the sense of Jewish growth that occurred for me while I was there. And still, even being a rabbi now for 17 years, or starting my 17th year, I'm constantly going back to the growth that happened for me many years before that at Pardes. And just so honored to be able to be part of this group and to teach a little bit of Torah in this difficult time. So I want to start with something that at the beginning seems really esoteric, seems really closed off to practical meaning. And in one of these great ways the classical texts begin to open up, that's what we're going to do. So it begins actually with a Mishnah in the tractate Bava Batra. It's very kind of technical, does not seem to have any relationship to anything ethical or moral, but as we go, you'll see it really opens up. And essentially there's a question about if people are sharing courtyards, can the other members of the courtyard coerce a person living there to build a gatehouse? And the Mishnah tells us, this is in Bava Batra 1.5, that the anonymous opinion, the Tanakama says, yes, the other members of the courtyard can coerce an individual to build this gatehouse in their courtyard. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that not all courtyards require gates. So there's a machloket, a debate here. And now turn to the next slide. This is going from the Mishnah, now jumping to the Talmud. And the Gemara asks, are we supposed to take away from this short little debate in the Mishnah that building a gatehouse is a good thing? Is it to be celebrated? Is it the ideal way to do things? And it seems, again, with the Tanakhama saying that you are able to force one of your neighbors to do this, that it seems like a beneficial and praiseworthy thing. And then in this amazing Talmudic way, the Talmud sometimes brings stories that either challenges or supports, sometimes undermines the seeming kind of legalistic debate that's happening. And that's one of these moments right here, where after asking this question, the story is related that wasn't there a pious man whom the prophet Eliyahu would come to speak with? He'd come for visits. And this Chassid, or in the Aramaic Chassidah, built a gatehouse according to this custom laid out in the Mishnah. And afterward, Elijah did not visit him anymore. So again, this doesn't scream out to be deeply inspirational text, but just watch as we start to unpack pieces of it. So the first question I want to ask is, what does it mean to be a Chassidah in Aramaic, a Chassid in Hebrew, a pious person? There are actually a lot of different understandings of this. So normally you'd think that a Chassid is someone who's righteous or holy. That would be kind of the kind of popular assumption about it. There are some who say that a Chassid is actually someone who's foolishly pious, who overdoes it in a way that might be looked down upon. But I want to call on Aryeh Cohn, who's a modern Talmud scholar, and he looks at a number of different examples where Chassid is used in the Mishnah, specifically in Pirkei Avot, and seems to come up with a great working definition that a Chassid is someone who is serious and thoughtful about the way they observe and try to be a good citizen in the world, and that they're always willing to go a little bit extra. So it's not that this pious person here is someone who is unattainable for us as a role model, but is someone who's just doing a little bit more than the basics of what everyone would expect that they have to do. The second thing to unpack is, what is the role of Eliyahu here? And does he show up in other stories? And what role does he play in the Talmud in general? So that's obviously a big question. To try to limit it a little bit, I want to just say that one of the many roles that Eliyahu plays in Talmudic literature is that he seems to be someone who comes to correct people who are doing things that are not illegal, that are not egregiously terrible, but especially for someone who's considered a chassid or pious, something that is in the gray area where they're missing something. So this notion that Eliyahu comes and sees that this person has built a gatehouse, and that seems to be the pretext for not visiting anymore, seems to be some kind of rebuke, some kind of reaction to the actions of this person, and Elijah's way of saying that this is not the right way to live. If you have a courtyard, you don't want to build these kind of gatehouses. And as we start to look into why this could be, it's going to become very clear how this relates to compassion fatigue, and also to larger issues with social justice. I want to say just one other thing. It's interesting, the other story where Elijah shows up that's very well known is in Ketubot 106a. And this is a story where a person who, gives a gift essentially to a rabbi, to Rabbi Anan, who's about to adjudicate a case. And very quickly, Rabbi Anan realizes this is not a kosher thing to do, to accept a gift, and he refuses the gift, and he steps out of the case. He recuses himself from the case and gives it over to a very well-known rabbi, to Rabbi Yochanan. And essentially what happens is Rabbi Yochanan's name and reputation is so big that this other person drops the case right off the bat, and the whole thing gets tabled. And as a result of this, Eliyahu stops learning and studying with Rabbi Anan. They were chavruta, they were study partners. So again, it's a situation, it's not clear that Rabbi Anan did anything wrong, but it seems to be that he should have been able to foresee that just washing his hands of this wasn't enough. He had to step in to actually make justice happen. He didn't do it. And again, Eliyahu is there kind of to call those to act in the right way. So next slide. The question is, what was the problem with the gatehouse? And here we turn to Rashi, kind of the most famous and ubiquitous Talmudic commentator. And Rashi explains something that seems very disconnected from the plain meaning of what the Talmud is dealing with. But he says the problem with the gatehouse is that it blocks out the people who are tzoakim, who are calling out, who are begging essentially for money or some kind of tzedakah or financial assistance. And again, if you can imagine the geography of this, the idea is that if there is a courtyard without a gatehouse, these poor people or people in need can get closer to you, and you'll hear them begging for things. But once you put that gatehouse to kind of close off the courtyard, all of a sudden you have insulated yourself. You can't hear their calls. So the question is, where is Rashi getting this from? Because it's not clear that this comes directly out of the Talmudic text itself. And so if you start to look, the shoresh, the word root here from tzoakim, tsadi ayin kuf, shows up in a number of places in the Torah. Famously, it shows up in the book of Exodus, the children of Israel groaning under the weight of Egyptian bondage it's the same word root, are calling out to God to be freed and to have the yoke, that burden taken off of them. It's also interesting that later on, Pharaoh, specifically, the Torah goes out of its way to show that Pharaoh does not heed the tzoakim of the children of Israel. So there's already a juxtaposition here that God is kind of the hero and can hear the cries of those who are the needy, and Pharaoh, who becomes the archetype of someone who is hardened and callous and cannot have empathy, doesn't hear or respond to that crying. And what's also interesting, it shows up later on in Exodus 22, where the Torah goes out of its way to say that God is the one who hears the cries of the most vulnerable in society, the widow and the orphan, and then points out that, that if we don't in turn follow God's role model and listen and hear this, the tzoakim, those who are calling out to us, that God's anger will be kindled against us and that we'll be punished for this. So we think that Rashi is probably drawing on this other kind of larger biblical tradition to come to this understanding, but it seems very clear at this point that if you are living in a world where there are people of different means, where justice is not deployed equally across the board, and that there may be people who are living in relative comfort, and maybe those people are even feeling overwhelmed by the various kind of needs that exist in the world, that even in that situation, that we're not intended to build this kind of gatehouse to protect ourselves from these sounds, that we should hear it. And I just say, like, when I encountered this text, why it hit me so personally is I was thinking, especially in the last few years, there have been many times where I have metaphorically built that gatehouse, where there's just too much happening in the world. And I also am running an organization that takes care of a lot of young people and has a lot of its own organizational needs. I'm the father of 3 young children, and a partner to an incredible law professor who is also building a career, and also the younger child of aging parents on both sides of our family. There are a huge amount of responsibilities, and there have been times over the past few years where, rather than lean in to a situation to hear the calls of the needy or to even deeply engage in the news, I find myself sometimes indulging in escapism, to like get caught into some binge watching, or to watch something on Netflix, or to see something on YouTube, almost anything to just take a pause from it. And there's a lot of guilt that is associated with it. And then, of course, there are these texts that come and kind of offer up this very powerful model of what we should be doing in each of these situations, is to lean in, to hear these voices and not do anything to insulate ourselves, or to protect ourselves from the pain that might come from associating all of this information. And so there's a tension here, right? There's a tension of self-care and understand the fallibility of our own limits and our own humanity with this example that's being raised up in Jewish textual tradition. But I want to hold this tension a little bit longer, and I want to show you the next text. But just to close this out, it seems to be that, at least from this text in Bava Batra and Rashi's comment on it, our job is to constantly lean in and try to hear, to not mute the sound of all of that pain that exists out there in the world. Now, if you can flip to the next text, this is from Vayikra Rabbah, Leviticus Rabbah, which is the collection of rabbinic interpretation and midrashim on the book of Leviticus. If you spent any time reading the book of Leviticus, you know that it's sometimes hard to penetrate in terms of discovering religious or personal or ethical meaning. I think the rabbis felt the same way, because as you look through Vayikra Rabbah, you will see that they go off on incredible tangents that have nothing to do with the direct meaning of the text. And this is a great example of it. But this is an unbelievable little play on words that I want to share with you. And I think it adds another layer here. So here it's in the name of Rabbi Zera. And he's saying that even conversations between people in the land of Israel are like Torah and Torah study. And so he gives the example of when a poor person is asking a rich person for tzedakah, that they might say in the land of Israel, zakibi or rakibi. These are the Aramaic for give me tzedakah or give me charity. And he does a little play on words where, when they're saying this, it actually means that you should benefit yourself through me. This is hinting at the idea that the person who gives tzedakah is actually getting more by the process of giving it than actually the person receiving it. But then there's the second play on words, which I really love, in the name of Rabbi Haggai, where he says that sometimes what happens is the poor person doesn't say zakibi or rakibi, but when they're saying that, it actually, what we should learn from it and hear from it is sakibi, which means see me, observe me, understand who I am. And I think the message that I've always taken away from this text is that when you are confronted with a situation where there's someone who has needs tremendously larger than what you could ever fix in passing them on the street by buying them a sandwich or giving them $1, that the real purpose of tzedakah in that moment is not to solve their problems. It's not really even about the money, but it's about that moment of encounter, that when someone says, zakibi, give me money for charity, what they're really saying is see me. I want to be a seen person. I want I want you to break down that wall that separates you from me. And I think that this, again, opens up another level of what we can do in these moments, which is part of what we're supposed to do when confronted with a complex set of things that led this person to be needy or homeless, well beyond what we can fix, is that at the very least, we have to see this person. We have to confront them. We have to confront the pain they have. We have to confront the pain that we have not being able to fix those problems. And sometimes, right, the theory is that even if we can't fix it in that moment, that by not hardening our hearts, not being fair, but by being responsive, we are transformed. And I think that this is really the thing that connects the story from the Talmud and this thing here from V'ikra Rabbah, which is one of the essential ways that we continue to do good in the world and that we resist feeling overwhelmed or a paralyzing sense of compassion fatigue, is that first, we recalibrate what our expectations are about what we're supposed to do to help. We do not need to be messianic and to fix every problem we encounter or to even have an answer for how to fix the larger systemic problems facing us. But what we need to do is to lean in and hear these people's stories, to hear people's pain, and to see them in full 360-degree and three-dimensional depth, to see their humanity, and to see what that conjures up inside of us, both in our hearts and in our minds, through our ears and through our eyes. And the theory being here that simply by transforming ourselves in a continual way through these deep encounters, that while we can never live up to some perfect ideal, to be there in every single moment and to respond to every need equally across the board, the idea is that we are continually forcing ourselves to grow. And so I think if you were going to ask me to say, like, what are the two lessons from these texts that address how we battle compassion fatigue in this kind of moment, is first is to have more modest and more humane sets of expectations for ourselves, which is we want to make a difference, but that each of these things is bigger than one intervention can fix. And sometimes by understanding that we don't have to have all the answers, we can feel a sense of hope and optimism about what we can give. And the second piece of it is that I believe that love and compassion, that fundamentally our hearts are elastic, that there is no zero-sum game of how much love and compassion we have. I believe that compassion fatigue comes from feeling like we can't do anything and we don't have room, but it's not actually because we don't have room. And so in those moments where we feel overwhelmed and fulfilled and like there's no room left, I think that part of what Jewish tradition is offering us as concrete advice is if you feel like you can't do more, at least keep listening and keep looking so that your heart will grow, so that your emotional and compassion pathways will deepen, and that when you are at a point in your life, in your month, in your week, in your day, where you do have more to give, that you will already have the ethical and spiritual and personal growth needed behind that to be able to then engage and give again. Thank you.
Mike, Yashar Kochacha. I want to just remind everyone of the Q&A feature, and we'll have some time at the end of this session to address comments and questions. So feel free during the presentations to list comments and questions in that Q&A feature. I'd like to turn to the book of Jonah, Sefer Yonah, and it is familiar to many of you from Yom Kippur afternoon. But in the midst of a day of fasting and prayer, we might not fully appreciate all of the varied lenses of that text. And among other things, the book of Jonah presents us with a wonderful and illustrative case of compassion fatigue, and contrasts Jonah's compassion fatigue with the notion of a God who has endless compassion. So I want to begin toward the beginning of the book. This is the next slide. And you know the story. I'll just read a few of the verses here. Now the Lord cast a mighty wind into the sea. Jonah, of course, is fleeing from God. God tells him to go to Nineveh, and instead he flees. He gets a boat in Jaffa, in Yaffo, and goes to Tarshish, and a great storm is caused. And I want to look with you at verses 5 and 6 here. And the sailors were frightened, and each one called out to his God, and they cast the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. And Jonah went down to the ship's hold, lay down, and fell fast asleep. And then verse 6, and the captain of the ship, Vayikrav elav Rav HaChovel, the captain of the ship approached him, Vayomer lo, and said to him, Ma lacha nirdam, why are you sleeping? Get up, call out to your God. Perhaps God will think about us and we will not perish. Now, it's understandable that in the midst of an enormous storm and in the midst of the enormous metaphorical storm, that we might just want to go to sleep. The feeling that everything is simply too much is something that I think is easy for many of us to relate to. The inner sources, the inner resources that we need to activate these days may completely exhaust us. And so we might understand and sympathize with Jonah, who goes down to take a nap, right? The sea is roaring, the wind is picking up, the ship is sailing out of control. There's a lot of drama on the ship. The sailors are crying out and praying, and Jonah goes and takes a nap. He is completely checked out. And this may be the first documented case of what psychologists call learned helplessness. When people feel that they have no control over their situation, they may begin to behave in a helpless manner. And this inaction can lead people to overlook opportunities for relief and change. The idea of learned helplessness is there's nothing I can do. And so since I feel helpless, I will act in a totally helpless manner. But of course, human beings are not helpless. And even when we can't solve the problem, there's something that we can do to contribute positively toward addressing it or toward ameliorating it in some way. And learned helplessness might be one of the forms of anxiety and depression that have emerged in a more pervasive form over the last 7 months. Many of us feel totally helpless. And if we're totally helpless, there's absolutely nothing I can do, then the impulse to check out and simply fall asleep is understandable. So I want to return to the response of the sailors and their captain. Ma lecha nirdam, why are you sleeping? This question is the most profound question in the entire book of Jonah, and maybe one of the best questions in the entire Tanakh. Ma lecha nirdam, why are you sleeping? And it's expressed by the characters in the story that one would least expect to model a religious or spiritual posture. And the captain continues, right? After he says, why are you sleeping? He says, get up and call out to your God. What does it mean to feel called? And for that sense of calling to wake us up, to inspire us, to prevent us from simply going into the bowels of the ship and falling asleep. And here I'm thinking about other sources about being awakened. Maimonides, the Rambam's interpretation of the meaning of the shofar, where he says, wake you slumberers from your sleep. The notion of wokeness, of an awareness of how the world should work and how it actually works. And I want to look at the rest of that verse. The sailors say, Ulai yit asheta Elohim lanu velo noved. Perhaps God will think about us and we will not perish. I want to focus on the word ulai, perhaps. Part of what we need to wake us up, to pull us out of a position of despair, to remove from us this sense of learned helplessness, is to entertain the world of what might be possible. Ulai, perhaps. To affirm that we don't know with absolute certainty that the problems of our day are fueled by an unrelenting momentum. We don't know with absolute certainty that there is no hope. Perhaps, ulai, there is a possibility of a different future. Perhaps there will be an effective and safe vaccine sooner. Perhaps we can overcome our history of racism and can create a system by which power and privilege can be harnessed to share power with those who have been disempowered and disenfranchised. Perhaps, ulai, perhaps we can address the climate crisis and reverse the trends of global warming. The second point that I want to bring from Jonah is the contrast between God's concern and compassion for the people of Nineveh with Jonah's lack of concern. And here, we'll go to the next slide. We need to understand that Nineveh, where he's called to prophesy, Nineveh is the capital of Assyria, the arch enemy of the Jewish people, and the nation that will destroy the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE. Now, the story of Jonah is set about 50 years before the Assyrian conquest, but it's actually written after. Jonah doesn't want to go to Nineveh because he doesn't care about the Assyrians, and he probably wants them to be destroyed. He certainly doesn't want to be the prophet who saves the enemy of the Jewish people from destruction. And while one can read the book of Jonah and be surprised by how well the people of Nineveh respond to Jonah's prophecy and how it inspires them to do repentance from the king to the beasts of the field, Jonah's refusal to go is grounded in his understanding that, of course, they would do teshuvah. And God, on the other hand, feels a sense of responsibility to give the people of Nineveh an opportunity to change. God wants the Assyrians to live. And so the book of Jonah is a shockingly universal text that God cares deeply about the fate of the other. And God even cares about nations who are the enemies of the Jewish people. So you know the story. Jonah goes to Nineveh and he gives a half-hearted prophetic call that Nineveh will be destroyed in 40 days. God forces his hand and he gets there, and in an almost comic way, he delivers the message with very little enthusiasm. He gets up and he says, 40 days more and Nineveh will be overthrown. In Hebrew, it's only 5 words. And then let's look at chapter 3, verse 10. And God saw their deeds, that they had repented of their evil way, and the Lord relented concerning the evil that he had spoken to do to them, and he did not do it. But the people hear loud and clear. When they're saved from destruction on account of their repentance, Jonah becomes distraught. And he says, basically, I knew that this would happen, and this is why I didn't want to go. He expresses displeasure in a way that provides such a sharp contrast between God's compassion and his lack of compassion. Look with me, please, at verse 1, chapter 4, same slide. Now this displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was grieved, and he prayed to the Lord and said, please, O Lord, was this not my contention when I was still on my land? For this reason, I had hastened to flee to Tarshish, because I knew that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger, with much kindness and relenting of evil. And here he has an allusion to what Tamar mentioned in her teaching as well. Jonah alludes to God's 13 attributes of mercy. And he quotes the first few. Ki yadati, ki ata el chanun v'rachum, erech apayim v'rav chesed. I didn't want to go to Nineveh, said Jonah, because I knew that God is a God of endless compassion. And he's so distraught that in verse 3, he says, and now, O Lord, take my soul from me, for my death is better than my life. Ki tov moti mechayai. Jonah has an inverted sense of the world as we would have it. Many of us think that it wouldn't be worth living in a world where there's no compassion for other people. But Jonah says, in essence, I want to live in a world of strict justice, a world in which our enemies are destroyed. And when he sees that Nineveh has been saved as a result of their repentance, he says, Ki tov moti mechayai. I would rather die than experience this. Finally, I want to really zero in on Jonah's response to God in that verse that we just recited. What do we mean by these attributes of God, these 13 attributes? In the book of Exodus, the words, these 13 attributes of God, are recited by God about God after the sin of the golden calf. And later in the Torah, after the sin of the spies bringing back the negative reports about the land of Israel, those, in an abbreviated form, those qualities of God, the qualities of mercy, of compassion, are recited by Moses back to God in an abbreviated form. And these play an important role in our liturgy, particularly the Slichot leading up to Yom Kippur and on Yom Kippur itself. These are words that we have used to remind ourselves of the presence of a forgiving and compassionate God. Rabbi Ezra Bick writes that the words create God's presence in the world. And Jonah says, Ki yadati, ki ata el chanun v'rachum. I knew that you are a loving and compassionate God. And so here too, Jonah presents us with an inverse example. He is the flawed prophet from whom we are learning the opposite of his example. What does it mean to know that God is El Hanun V'Rachum, right? Jonah says, Ki yadati, I knew of this about you, God, and that's why I didn't want to go. Well, there's another way of asking that question, which is, what does it mean to be called by the name of God? I want to turn to a midrash from Sifrei Devarim, a midrash on the book of Deuteronomy. This is the next slide. We're told to walk in God's ways. And when the Midrash here and elsewhere says, well, what does it mean to walk in God's ways? How does a human being walk in God's ways? It says, first, well, what are the ways of God? And here it reminds us that God is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abundant in loving kindness and truth. These are the 13 attributes. And then the Midrash quotes a verse from the prophet Joel. All who will be called by the name of God will escape. Kol asher yikra b'shem Adonai yimalet. And then the Midrash wants to know, well, what does it mean to be called by the name of God? What does it mean to be called by the name of the Holy One? And it tells us, just as God is merciful and gracious, so you too must be merciful and gracious and give graciously to all. Just as God is called righteous, you must be righteous. Just as God is called Chassid, full of loving kindness, you too must be full of loving kindness. When we exhibit compassion, this Midrash suggests, we are called by God's name. And called, meaning either that we are named after God. This might be alluding to the fact that Israel has God's name inside of it, Yisrael. But it might also address itself more broadly to this notion of calling. What is my calling? What is my purpose and my mission? If my mission is to be someone who brings God's presence into the world, someone who can lift up, someone who can remind each person of their dignity and uniqueness, someone who creates light, someone who can look out at the world as it is and say, this is very good, then I need to be someone who can themselves exercise compassion and mercy and loving kindness. And that might be what it means to be called by God's name, to be trying as much as is humanly possible to be someone who can exercise greater and greater compassion and mercy and loving kindness. I want to provide an opportunity for the three of us to respond to some of the Torah that we heard from each other, and then we'll open it up. I see there's a number of comments and questions, and so I think we can, yeah, great. We can all come together, the three of us. Thank you, Rebecca. And I'm happy to kick it off, Tamar and Mike. I was thinking, Tamar, of this connection that you mentioned between chesed, loving kindness, and the confrontation with death. And the beautiful text that you brought, that what this expression of kindness takes the form of the burial shroud. And what you mentioned, that all of what we do to honor the dead is called chesed shel emet. It's the truest form of chesed, of loving kindness. And I was thinking about how often when we're confronted by death, it brings out the truest, most genuine, and most compassionate sides of ourselves. I was thinking about, how gentle people are at a shiva, how I remember as a synagogue rabbi, how when I came back to my family after officiating at a funeral, I felt like I had a reordering of priorities, of what's really important in life, of who's important in my life. And I wondered if either of you have further thoughts about that idea, the connection between the confrontation with death and the way in which it evokes in us a sense of loving kindness.
I'm happy to share something, but Tamar, would you want to kick us off, or?
No, you can go first. You answered a lot of what I would have wanted to say. Yeah.
I just think it's it links, I guess, in some ways, Leon, to what you were teaching in Jonah and Yom Kippur, which is my sense of Yom Kippur. The power of it has always been that you're enacting a simulation of your own death, that in a non-kitschy way, it's like, the kind of cliche movie where the person, whoever the protagonist is diagnosed with some terminal illness, and it's only then that they say, I love you to the people they should say I love you to, or they recalibrate the values in their lives, that we're able to enact this every year without actually having a mortality scare. And I think we know this to be true in a much more granular way, which is, and I think this is where compassion fatigue comes in. When it's like, oh, this day is terrible, I'm never going to get done, I got a gazillion emails, and I got this meeting, I got to do this for the kids. And then as soon as you find out that someone close to you passed away, or there's a funeral that you have to go to, or a shiva that you have to go to, or someone needs something at that level, it's amazing how the calendar clears out and you don't even worry about it. And so that sense of elasticity of time and of commitment, any critical life or death moment hits us over the head with just how elastic time can be. And it's actually a tool that we could use, right, on a daily basis without it being a matter of life or death. And usually that sense of like, just don't have the time or the energy, usually is not nearly as true as it feels in the moment when we're saying that.
I really loved what you said, Mike. It kind of reminds me of Rabbi Lou's book. I also was just thinking that when you hear that someone has died, I feel like everything else just dissolves. Nothing seems to matter anymore, except for, in a way, serving and supporting that family, that community, the people who are in pain. And it also reminds me when you're faced with death, that this realization that we're not really in control. We sometimes we're under this illusion that we are in control of our lives. And I'm someone who's very much works around schedule and routine and order, and maybe because I'm trying very hard to resist the reminder that I am actually not in control. And yet when death comes upon us, there's this awakening that there is you are not in control. And that reminds me again that actually what really matters is all these acts that you can do to provide support, provide love, be kind. That in a way for me is just this reminder that that's all that matters in the end.
Mm. This is perhaps one of the blessings in this moment in which we're all living in such a vulnerable moment, and we're kind of living with pervasive death around us, and within that, this kind of consciousness, the possibility that there could be from this an increase in chesed, an increase in compassion and loving kindness, is maybe some kind of nechemta, some kind of consolation in all of this.
And I think it also, Tamar, what you said, it links into all of this, right? Which is giving over our own sense of power and control. There's a freedom that comes with it. And I actually think burnout and compassion fatigue come from holding up these fallacies of control or of perfectionism around our ability to engage around issues of justice. And it's a great excuse. Well, if I can't do it right, then I shouldn't be involved. And this kind of like letting go, I actually think like new energy flows back into you. I mean, even thinking about, Leon, what you said about Jonah, like the fatigue, it's a great word, because when we are overwhelmed with a sense of too many things that we should be doing better than we're doing, like you do want to take a nap. It is very depleting. But what's restoring is like when you can cut through that noise and actually do something little, right? Whether it's little or big, right? But to accomplish something that tends to refill. We often think that we need to pause to refill our own tanks, but sometimes it's actually, you just need to start to refill your own tanks. It's the energy around feeling like we have to have control or the right answer, at least for me, I think saps most of that energy.
We're gonna move in a moment to some questions and comments that our colleague Rebecca is very kind to curate for us. But I just wanted to say that I thought there was something very powerful about this text, which you brought, Mike, that essentially when you played with the midrash of give to me, meaning see me. And then you go back to the beginning of the Midrash and it says, well, this is the conversation of Torah in the land of Israel. What you're essentially saying is that the request to see me, that is Torah. And I was thinking, wow, what a enormous set of implications that has for us. That the conversation of Torah is a conversation in which we are saying to one another, see me, see who I am, understand me, understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah, it's I want to go back to link it also, because I think that part of what was so powerful about Tamar's teaching is, as she was laying it out, I was thinking like, how could Ruth, given how much pain and loss there was in her life, if anyone was going to be fatigued, it would be her. And yet she was able to pledge this like unbelievable set of commitments to Naomi. And then it ricochets around and it's like it inspires and replenishes other people around her. And so I think it's what I wrote down as Tamar was teaching was like, this is the power of proximity and relationship. And again, it's like, I think, the disconnect of trying to do social justice work through like what you say on social media, through kind of virtue signaling, the kind of fear around being called out for saying it wrong or doing it wrong. Or doing it at a great distance where it's a set of policy considerations, and you figure out where to invest your time or energy based on these kind of theoretical notions. All of those things work to sever the immediacy of the relationship. And I actually think that if people were looking for another tool of like what keeps you going and what can inspire those around you, is like the power of those relationships. So I think that that's that great implication of Sakibi, of like see me, is that it's easy to say, oh, don't give to the homeless person on the street because it encourages panhandling, and you should give to a well-established, well-researched nonprofit that does this work. But the power of doing something imperfect, like giving someone $1 face to face, which is a very complicated and problematic thing, the power of it is that it establishes some connection. And I think about all of those forces that are tearing our society in North America apart. And one of the great common threads is the dehumanization of the other, whether it's the other who is at a different socioeconomic level or a different political persuasion, a different part of the country. And what it's almost like the biggest cliche in the world. Whenever you get into dialogue with the other, whoever it is, everyone walks away saying they feel like this deeper sense of hope, because what they realized is this caricature in the media or on social media or around the Shabbos table, when you talk about them, when you actually get to meet them, that you have much more in common, and that those people are much more thoughtful and nuanced than the caricature. So again, I think it's like there's so much, it makes sense to want to run away from all this responsibility until you actually meet the person. And then it's a whole other different set of options that's in front of us.
It is so invigorating to share this panel and this session with both of you, Mike and Tamar. I want to get to some of the Q&A and some of the comments. We have a question here from Lynn Cromar to you, Mike, about as a Hillel rabbi, what advice would you give to young people who are unable to gauge what is worthy for action and what could be left for others? And Tamar, I think this is a great question for you as the dean of a day school as well, a high school. So they're unable to gauge, like, what should I do and what should be left for others to do? How do you address that?
So it's funny, I had read the question, and as you said it out loud, it had a different resonance. But the two things I would want to say about it are, one, when you say as a Hillel director dealing with young people, really one of the first things that always comes up for me right now is mental health. And it's such an intense issue. And I think that there is there's so much overachieving, especially at a place like Penn. And there's always the sense of like having to do and having to be great at everything you do, that I would not want this to just get simply transposed to how you go about, like I have to be an amazing student, and I have to have fun all the time, and I have to take amazing trips, and I have to be amazing and successful when it comes to doing justice in the world. And I think it answers the more direct question that was asked, which is like, how do you figure those things out? I actually think that my message to college students, and really my message to everyone in this situation, is just dive in. I think that that's the answer, is you don't wait until you have the right cause or the answer, you understand the policy well enough, you dive in. And that's that message of the essence of the work is to see and to hear. That ultimately is going to be the thing that helps you navigate those nuances. But I think one of the great dangers in trying to get involved in any of these causes is what's the right way for me to do it? What's the highest impact? I think it misaligns some of the values. And I think there's a whole longer text study here, but one of the things I love about one segment of Jewish textual tradition is it seems to say, if you read it this way, that don't think you can accomplish that much, right? At the end of the day, that you get more out of giving than you actually give, that there's a much more complicated set of risks of objectifying the other, actually disempowering them and trying to help them, that makes these problems worse. And so you have to, I think, enter with a great deal of humility. And the purpose is to grow and to be transformed as much as it is to help. I think there's some wisdom there. And so what I would say to young people is just get your hands dirty and you'll learn, just like everything else, by the way, that young people are doing in life. How do you fall in love? How do you figure out what you want to do with your life professionally? How do you figure out how much of your parents' teaching is going to stay with you as you emerge into adulthood, and how much of it you want to find other role models? You just experiment. And that's the beauty of this age. It's safe and identity is fluid, and you can experiment, and next semester you can be someone different.
Yeah, thank you. I also just want to say that I agree with everything that you said, especially the part about acting. Don't just wait till you feel comfortable talking about racism. If that matters to you, act. I mean, I also feel that with my high schoolers here in the Bay Area, particularly, where students are very passionate about a lot of issues, climate change, Black Lives Matters. We speak a lot about like having them identify their own values, like what matters to you. And once you figured out what matters to you, then you can start acting. And you've also got to be willing to be changed by the experience. And as you said, Mike, that maybe by next semester it might be something else. But as you said, identity is fluid, and you need to just throw yourself in there, be part of whatever you're interested in, and do the work.
Thank you. Faye Rosenberg Cohen, who was part of our summer session online this summer at Pardes, asks about prioritization. You know, how do you in developing a compassionate response, how do you determine priorities between feeding seniors and Jewish engagement, helping the poor, sustaining day schools? And she says, rightfully, she writes, it's exhausting.
Mhm.
Thoughts about prioritization and I feel like compassion fatigue, then that's like getting over that is step one. And I think that the question is pointing the way to the really hard decisions that we have to make, which themselves are exhausting.
Actually, when I saw that question, I started feeling exhausted just reading it, and felt myself shutting down. You spoke about escapism, Netflix. I felt myself like I wanted to switch off this computer and just like pretend I didn't see that question. But then I'm reminded that yes, there's all these issues that are so important, and that's when I feel that you have to have this conversation with yourself and say, okay, what are my values? What do I want to spend my energy with? Because you can't do it all. I mean, that's the sad thing. And so some things you'll say, okay, this I can't do right now. And I know that at the beginning of this, the shutdown and everything that happened, I made a list for myself. I said, these are my values. These are the things that correspond with my values. This is where I'm going to dedicate my time right now. That doesn't mean that everything else isn't important. They are important. And my hope, as you said, Mike, everything's fluid. My hope is that in next month, 2 months time, I will go back and do those things. But for right now, I made a list, and I'm absolutely committed to that list, and to do as much as I can to those things. I actually also wanted to just add one other thing, and maybe I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but I'm, as Mike also said, and Leon, we're all parents of very young children. We also teach young adults, some of us younger than others. And I feel you spoke about the power of relationships and proximity. I feel like we don't have the luxury really to escape. It's not like I can sleep in and not get up and have to attend to my child. And I actually feel that's a great model for us, because I realize that there is tremendous responsibility and burden on us, where we have to, even if I'm pretending, I'm just pretending to care. I recognize that I'm a role model, that I serve these young children, these young adults, and even if I'm just pretending, it is important that I behave in a certain way. So I think that I went off on a little tangent there,
No,
but
it's great, and I'm very relieved to hear that sometimes you pretend to be listening deeply to your children, because I feel that often. But I actually think it links with what I wanted to say. It's good that we're all in so much agreement. When I saw that question, I thought, God, that was the one question I hope didn't get asked. But in hearing you respond and thinking about it for a second, it feels to me like there's two levels to that question. One, and I think that sometimes we skip one of the levels. We jump right to the practical, which is what do we do first, or how do we, especially in a kind of Jewish volunteer leadership context or in a federation context, we're thinking about limited amounts of money and endless amounts of priorities. And so we jump very quickly to the practical. And I want to go back and say that I think there's two equally important layers here, which is there's a spiritual element. which is, and the spiritual piece is where there aren't as many limits. So I think step one is like, how do we cultivate in ourselves? How do we use Jewish technology and Jewish tradition to cultivate in ourselves an ever-growing depth of ability to think spiritually and compassionately about these things? And I think that part of that is how deeply we listen and see. And I think that Tamar, I'm really glad you said, I think part of it is like acting as a role model, even if you know that you can't follow that up with a grant or with money or with time, but to model for other people the power of presence and connection, so that someone else may be able to pick up that ball that you can't carry all the way to the finish line. And then I think there's the practical piece. And I think that the second, and this is linked, I think, in some ways to Jonah and to very much our world, which is when it comes to the practical piece, the thing I feel like over and over again, and maybe this is my own defensiveness, but like there isn't enough compassion in how we respond to each other's attempts to make the world a better place. And especially now in a world of cancel culture, there are a lot of young people who want to do it right, and they're just afraid that if they get it wrong, that there's a price to pay for that. And I think it's interesting on the biggest day of the year for Jews to figure out if they can restart their lives in a new way. Who is the hero of tshuva and repentance? Is Jonah. He gets it wrong. He falls asleep. He goes below. The non-Jewish crewmates on the boat know all the answers. They're totally connected to God and the truth. And Jonah is totally asleep. When God wants Jonah to go on this prophetic message, he runs away. He runs to water as if God doesn't exist on the sea. Like it's a kind of blasphemy even. He gets it wrong and ultimately he comes around and gets it right. And I think that is just such an important thing, that there are people with good intentions who don't know how to do it, who get the priorities wrong, who execute in a way. The key is just to be compassionate to ourselves and to those around us, that we're always in a process of learning and growing. And we're not looking for perfection, right? We're looking to move in an asymptotic way closer to perfecting the world, but it doesn't require each of us to be perfect in that process.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wish we had more time, and I want to conclude by bringing a teaching from Sefer HaChinuch, which bases itself on the Babylonian Talmud, on a passage from Kiddushin, in which it says, kindness and mercy are among the most worthy qualities in the world. And if somebody would teach themselves to be cruel, they would be attesting that they are not a true Jew, because Jews are called Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanim, compassionate children of compassionate parents. Now, this, of course, this is the parasha of Lech Lecha, of Abraham Avinu, who himself is a symbol of compassion. This description of us as a people who are Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanim, compassionate children of compassionate parents, it's clearly more aspirational than descriptive. But we need aspirations, and particularly in a time as challenging as this one, we need to aspire to overcome this compassion fatigue and to be B'nai Rachmanim and Benot Rachmanim. I want to thank you, Tamar and Mike, and behind the scenes, Rebecca and Tess from JFNA. And I want to thank all of you. I'm sorry we didn't have an opportunity to get to all of the questions and comments, but it's wonderful to be able to study Torah with all of you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.